now.
Okay, so welcome everyone. Hope you're all doing well on this beautiful day. So, a couple things I wanted to touch on before we got into the presentation per se. I wanted to share something from Bill Innes, who's been watching the class as well. He's a professor at Osher. I met him via Joel Roisman, actually. And he sent me an interesting article that appeared in the New York Times recently. So, where was it? Let me just try to find it. Okay, that's not what I was looking for. Here we go. So this is related to what we've been talking about in a certain sense. He talks about the Times reports that in 1883 you had 15 manuscripts found near the Dead Sea, which caused a sensation. This is not what we're talking about per se tonight. We're actually going to be talking about the Cairo Geniza. So these were found earlier on in 1883, shortly before the Cairo Geniza discovery was made, and we'll talk about what exactly the Cairo Geniza is. But as you see, they're written in Hebrew script, and they were said to be an alternative to the book of Devarim, or Sefer Deuteronomy, the book of Devarim. But interestingly enough, they were denounced as a forgery, and the discovery, the guy who has discovered it was basically disgraced. But now scholars feel new scholarship shows perhaps this is real. This discovery, these are authentic ancient documents with perhaps an alternative version of Deuteronomy, and that's what we're looking at. These scrolls, which are found in the Dead Sea collection, which often match up directly with what we have, but at times have alternative versions as well. So, just an interesting piece. So, I thank Bill for sharing that with us as well. Other question came from Aida Wasserstein regarding the Torah. Most scholars believe that the Exodus was about 1290 before the Common Era or so. So that's when Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, would be dated. Now, the traditional view, the quote unquote religious point of view, is that basically God gave the Torah to Moshe at Sinai. When we say Torah at Sinai, we really mean there was a revelation at Sinai. Clearly, he's not giving all five books of the Torah to Moshe on Sinai, simply because two and a half books have yet to unfold. Like the Torah we'll be reading tomorrow, and for Shabbat during the Torah reading, obviously is post Sinai, right post Sinai, immediately post Sinai, but post Sinai. But the traditional view is God gives these scrolls to Moshe, or God gives reveals himself to Moshe, and Moshe goes the rest of his life writing it basically as it goes along. According to the rabbis, he writes, I believe it's 13 Sifrei Torah on the last day of his life, and then the story is complete. From an academic point of view, scholars would say that the Torah, as we have it, really was put redacted around the year 400 by Ezra, is the most common theory. So that leaves a lot of room for later developments. Now, that in certain circles would be heresy, by the way, to say it. And I'm not endorsing. I'm just simply saying there's a traditional take, a quote unquote religiously correct take, and then there's an academic take, which is different, and it's a scholarly take as opposed to a theological take. Okay, so let me move back. Let me move now into the presentation for this evening. Does anyone have any questions before I on what I just said? Can everyone hear me?
I just wanted to say I take Bill Innes's class and he's excellent. It's an excellent class.
Okay, so he's right. He's working on. I think he's just published a book as well, actually. So I met him. I spoke to him. Very bright guy. I have not taken his class. Well, I don't think I'm allowed to. What's the deal for Osher? I don't think I'm allowed to take his class. You have to be of a certain age, correct?
You have to be 55.
Okay, so all right, right. So but he's a very bright guy, and Harriet is recommending his classes. So something to consider as you look at the summer courses and courses for next fall at
He
Osher.
was in my writing class, and I thought the stuff that he presented was really good.
Oh, okay, terrific. So another endorsement. Another endorsement. of Bill's work. Thank you, Aida. Okay, so let's look at the presentation for tonight. Let me I'm using a different device, so it's taking me an extra minute. No, that's not what I wanted to do. Present, there we go. Okay, can everyone see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Ron. So here we go. So we're talking about the Cairo Geniza. So first of all, what is the Cairo Geniza? What was found in it? Let's take a look at that. So first of all, what is a Geniza? So as many of you know, when you're talking about Jewish holy texts with God's name on it, written in Hebrew at least, they are not supposed to be discarded in the trash. They're considered holy. So you either bury them or keep them in basically a storeroom of some sort called a Geniza. So what happened here is in the 1890s, about 200,000 manuscripts or parts of manuscripts were found in this storehouse in the medieval Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo. In other words, the Cairo Geniza. So this was found in the 1890s, and it sounds wonderful. But for particularly what we're concerned about here, because our topic is the Dead Sea Scrolls, is there were 2 copies of the Damascus document found, which had never been, no one knew about. These were previously unknown. Now, remember, this is well before 1947 when the scrolls are found at Qumran. So these are 2 scrolls of and they basically aren't particularly significant in any way. Remember, you found 200,000 fragments here, but of course later on when they're found again at Qumran, then this is like, wow, these were 2 Dead Sea Scrolls which showed up years earlier in Egypt. So later on, K4 yielded several fragment copies of this same Damascus document in the 1950s. So it wasn't among the first wave of documents were found in 1947, but this is basically the second wave of findings. We find these scrolls, and people start to match the archaeologists and the scholars start to match them up and realize this is the same document that was found in Cairo years and years earlier. Now, how was it brought to light? Another interesting story, and we spoke at great length about the original publicity of the scrolls. Then it was a very bizarre story. It's not like you think that they found them and everyone is like, wow, this has to become known to the public. It took years and years. So it's not quite as dramatic here, but it's not immediate. So scholars became aware of this find in the Geniza in the 1890s, but travel to the Middle East was hard. It wasn't like nowadays you hop on a plane and you're there in a few hours. So eventually what happens is 2 Scottish sisters, Mrs. Lewis and Gibson, were able to obtain some of the documents and brought them to Solomon Schechter, who is a Hebrew reader at Cambridge. He's a leading Jewish scholar of the day. And of course, this is very exciting to him. And Cambridge helped Schechter purchase 140,000 of them, which are still housed at Cambridge today. The Jewish Theological Seminary in Manhattan bought 40,000 of them, and other copies are in Manchester and St. Petersburg, Russia. And I decided to put in Russia in case anyone was going down to Orlando and decided to make a side trip over to St. Pete down there and try to see him. So this is in Russia. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Okay, so findings. So what else was found in the Cairo Geniza before we start focusing in on this one particular document here? Because this will help put everything in context here. So we found early manuscripts of the Mishnah. Remember, the Mishnah is the first part of the Talmud, or this really when the Jewish oral law was written down. This happens about 200 of the Common Era, Yehuda Hanasi, Jude of a Prince. And basically the idea was that as Jews go into exile, oral teachings will be lost if they're not written down. So we find early manuscripts of the Mishnah. This is always valuable to find early manuscripts because, as we've said before, sometimes when you find different manuscripts of the same text, they don't match up identically. So we also found manuscripts of the 2 Talmuds. What I mean by that is we have the Babylonian Talmud, and the academies of Sora and Pompadita, that part of the world, basically modern day Baghdad. And then we have the Talmud Yerushalmi, or the Jerusalem Talmud, which is from Jerusalem or Eretz Israel. Now, just an interesting side note, you may think that the Talmud Bavli, I mean, the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud is the more important one because it's from Eretz Israel. Not the case, actually. The Talmud Bavli is considered the more authoritative. It's actually larger. It's more encyclopedic. It gives you not only discussions about law, but also has more of the Agada, or the stories as well, which rabbis often like for sermons. So other things that were found were the Hebrew original of the of Ben Sira, which is an apocryphal text. Remember, he said apocrypha were books that apocrypha means hidden, so they didn't make it into the Jewish canon, the Jewish biblical canon. Later on, they appear in the Greek version, the Septuagint, and then preserved by the Catholic Church. We also find texts of the Targum, which is the translation of the Torah into Aramaic, because Jews were speaking after being exiled. After the first temple is destroyed and Jews wind up in Mesopotamia, the language spoken is Aramaic. And during the Second Temple period, many Jews, the regular spoken language was Judaicized version or Hebraicized version of Aramaic. So we find translations into Aramaic, and that's not particularly surprising. It's like going into a thousand years from now, going into a shul in America and finding a Torah or a Chumash with Hebrew and English. So not surprising, but they found. I think what was big was they found new texts as well, as the Tanakh is being expanded, as the Jewish canon is being expanded. First from the 5 books of Moshe, around 400 of the Common Era, then 200 of then two. And I'm talking from a scholarly point of view now. From 200 before the Common Era, you have the Nevi'im, the prophetic works really put in the final form. So more and more of these books are being added. And then anywhere from 90 after the CE Common Era until 200, scholars debate, you have the Ketuvim, the final books as well. So yeah, so as books were being added to the Jewish biblical canon, we find translations of some of these later books into later books for Targum, with a translation into Aramaic, which tells us that these books were being obviously read by, let's say, Jews in places like Alexandria, or even in Eretz Israel, where Jews were basically speaking Aramaic, and they may have not been able to handle, or may have been more comfortable simply reading it in Aramaic. So we also find autobiographical text and other letters signed by the Rambam, Maimonides. So that's pretty neat as well. And strangely enough, they found a commentary by Saint Augustine on the Sermon of the Mount, which is in the Gospel of Matthew. If you remember, for those of you who attended the other class we did on Professor Ruderman about Jews in Christian and Muslim lands, Saint Augustine is an early church father, about 400 of the Common Era, who comes up with the idea that Jews should not be beaten up or killed. Rather, they should live with their backs bent, as he says, as basically second-class citizens, to show what happens when people don't accept Jesus, in the hopes of eventually will make life uncomfortable enough for them, and eventually they'll get the point and convert. So these were among the more dramatic findings at the Geniza. Okay, so now the Damascus Document is what we really want to focus on here. So we have these 2 medieval manuscripts, 10th to 12th century, which were found. So this is when they believe the manuscripts of the document were actually penned. Okay, scholars, however, realize that very quickly, by the way, realize these were much earlier. These were copies of a much earlier document, but they still weren't exactly sure what Jewish sect they came from. They just realized it's from a much earlier era than the 10th to 12th century. So Schechter originally thought they were the Dositheans, or this is a Samaritan group. If you remember, we've spoken about the Samaritans. This was a group of people who was living around Jerusalem, the area of Jerusalem, as the Second Temple was being built, and was seen by the Jews returning as exile as not Jewish, even though they had some Jewish practices. And obviously the Samaritans are around. We've all heard the term a good Samaritan. There was a lot of tension, by the way, during the Second Temple period between the Jews and the Samaritans. By the way, the point of the story of a good Samaritan is Samaritans had a bad reputation in the Jewish community. So it was a term that was supposed to shock you, like someone saying the good criminal. Like, wait a minute, that's an oxymoron. How could you be good and a criminal at the same time? So without passing judgment on the Samaritans, it's meant to shock the populace, that type of term. So, and the Samaritans, by the way, are still around in a very small group today. Okay, but it turns out it's not a Samaritan document. Louis Ginsburg, who he died in 1953, I think it was. He was a scholar at JTS. Produced an interpretation of this work of a Damascus document. He called it an unknown sect because they still weren't exactly sure. This is really like a commentary, interpretation. Really, commentary is maybe a better word. And he calls it an unknown sect, believing this was a work of a splinter group of Pharisees. So we're getting a little closer now, because we're talking about Jews at this point as opposed to Samaritans who aren't Jews. But as we later on are going to learn, of course, it's not a splinter Pharisaic group. It is its own group completely. Okay, and by the way, manuscripts later are found in caves 4, 5, and 6 as well. And this is considered one of the the Dead Sea sect's seminal texts, really laying out a lot of what they do and how they live their lives. So why is it titled, first of all, the Damascus Document? They are not in Damascus, that's for sure. Okay, so the title comes from a repeated mention of the sect's exile to Damascus based on a reinterpretation of Amos. So basically, Damascus is like a code word for the sect being exiled to their own location where they can start their own community. And as we said, basically, they seem to, we suspect they probably self-exiled in the sense that they're simply so unhappy with the practices of the Jerusalem priesthood, and they feel it's not pure enough, that they can no longer tolerate it and separate and go into this self-imposed exile in the desert so they could have this pure community. You think about, for instance, the Pilgrims, let's say, or Puritans later on, basically leaving England to start communities they feel are going to be more pure. So the verse from Amos 5:27 is, "Therefore I cause you to go into captivity beyond Damascus, says he whose name is the Lord God of hosts." So Amos is really talking about if the people don't obey God's word this is during the first temple period, by the way, saying he's prophesying to the northern kingdom of Israel. He was from the southern kingdom and went up to the northern kingdom of Israel and basically told them to get their house in order, saying God was going to expel them, exile them if they don't turn back to God. So as you can imagine, he probably was not particularly popular. Here he is coming from the divided monarchy, coming from the south and going up north and basically telling everyone they're not doing a good job living their lives. But he says you're going to wind up being exiled to places like Damascus. So eventually the sect hooks onto this idea, and they view their place of exile as Damascus, shall we say. And says apparently it's a metaphor of a sect's exile from Jerusalem. Okay, so now let's look at the okay, did I want to make one more point actually on the previous slide? I may have wanted to make one point. Oh, so the point I wanted to make on the other slide is they saw exile in a certain sense as exile could be a form of salvation. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that because because you're not going to be destroyed along with the main populace, you're already exiled. It could be a form of salvation. Like later on, the temple is destroyed in Jerusalem, and a lot of people are killed and sold into slavery by the Romans. And I'm actually being serious about it. It kind of reminds me of Superman. I think it's Superman 2 with General Zod. For Superman fans, if you remember. I'm not an expert. I'm hardly an expert in this myself, but there's General Zod and his two buddies lead a revolt against the authorities at Krypton, and for this they're exiled, and then Krypton blows up, And they later on, General Assad says, well, we were saved because we were exiled. We were kicked off the planet blew up. So therefore it worked out pretty well. So kind of a similar type of mentality here that exile actually could wind up saving you. Okay, so let's look at the body of the text itself. So we have the first part is the exhortation. So the exhortation deals with the founding of the community, which is about 390 years, about 390 years, excuse me, after Jerusalem's fall. That's the fall of the first temple. And I think about that for a minute again, I was reading the notes. The second temple has not yet fallen. This is 390 years or so after the destruction of the first temple in 586. So it places it a few decades after the beginning of the Hasmonean or Maccabean era, 165-ish, let's say. So it makes sense. This is when these Jewish sects really start to show up on the radar, about 140s or so before the Common Era. So makes perfect sense. Now it does mention the Morat Tzedek, which is the teacher of the righteous, who's a frequently named character in a lot of these scrolls. He seems to be a leader of the community that doesn't come on the scene originally, but scholars feel, Schiffman suggests about 20 years or so after the sect is formed, he really comes and he really becomes the leader and is able to really, he's probably a charismatic figure, is able to really become the leader of a sect. We don't know who he is. He's unnamed, which is kind of annoying. Okay. Bible sees, so it says the Bible sees the exile as punishment for the sin, for sin, and the Damascus document turns this into a praiseworthy action and promise of salvation. Okay, so this is where I meant to make the correlation between Superman 2. Is even though in general, like when Amos is talking about exile, it's not a good thing. But here the Damascus document turns it around and basically looks at it as, oh, God saved us. God is saving us by separating us from these bad people that are probably going to be destroyed by the Romans anyway. And we see Jerusalem, of course, does fall. Of course, the sect itself doesn't survive also, but don't tell them that. Okay. Also, it talks about men can have more than one wife. Remember, the prohibition on Jews having more than one wife is much later on in Jewish history. So looks like this sect was ahead of the curve. And this same passage may be read to prohibit divorce as well, but then scholars are not quite sure about that. And additionally, it goes beyond what we already have, and it's a prohibition on an uncle and niece marrying each other. So we see they're extra machmir or rigid, strict, as we'd say, even stricter than Jewish practice requires. And we're going to see in a minute that really shouldn't be much of a surprise. But let's go to part 2 first. Part 2 talks about the statutes. And the most significant section talks about observance of Shabbat. Now, here again, they're stricter than the way the rabbi, the Pharisees or the rabbinic group comes to understand Shabbat observance. Shouldn't be as a surprise because Josephus says that the Essenes are the strictest of all the groups, and we're pretty certain this is at least a form of Essenes of this group, probably a strict form of Essenes. So the fact they were particularly strict was not surprising. Okay, and we should note here that all the sects agree that the Torah was divine. So we kind of tangentially addressed that earlier on. Everyone is saying here that the Torah we have is basically a transmission from God to Moses. Those are the 5 books. The prophetic works are also nevuah, prophecy, not as direct as God speaking to Moshe, but nevertheless, God communicating with prophets. So all of this is divine. What they are debating over is the interpretation and how the practices affect Jewish life. As the best example is probably with Shavuot. When does Shavuot fall? Where you had the Pharisees had one understanding of when it falls. This goes into, because the Torah doesn't give us a date for the holiday of Shavuot. It talks about it. You start counting the Omer of a day after Shabbat. Day after Shabbat, and you count 49 days, and the 50th day of Shavuot. So it depends. So then there's an argument over what is Shabbat. Is it the first day of Pesach? Is it the first Shabbat that falls during Pesach? So we see the Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes all could have had different days in which they were celebrating Shabbat. So this is really what they're arguing over here. Okay. So the next lecture, we're going to look at Pesher, which is a form of interpretation where we look at text and we try to understand the text in terms of modern occurrences. So the Qumran sect would be reading the Torah and saying, well, how does this relate to us living in the 40s, the 50s, whatever? And I'm talking about 40 or 50 CE, or as opposed to the 1940s, of course. And people do this all the time today. People say, oh, the Torah says this is how it applies to us. So let's exit the screen share and open it up to Q&A. Okay. Questions, please, comments?
One quick question, Rabbi.
Sam.
Can you give any details on the Geniza itself? I mean, was it found in a cave, or how was it found?
It seems to be found in some sort of room, like storehouse in a synagogue. I don't have more detail. I'm just going on what I read, but it was like, it's probably and if you think about it, well, you're like, how in the world could these things be hidden away? I thought about it for a couple minutes, and I thought about when we were selling the old building at 4412 Washington Street. Paula Gordon in particular, who was going through it, kept coming to me with all these old documents and stuff like that. So, I mean, in a certain sense, given there were so many documents, it's not like 50 documents, it's 200,000, that's a lot of documents, but it probably was, it was a repository at one point where people were just putting discarded texts. And I don't know how active the synagogue was in the first place. If the synagogue wasn't being used very much or just being used for special occasions, you could certainly see more so how no one realized what was going on. I think Scott has something to add.
You're muted, Scott. Scott, you're muted.
Sam, I have two books. One, Sacred Trash by Adina Hoffman. It shows a picture of Schechter sitting at the Geniza going through the doc. It's a great book. Another one is Sacred Treasure, the Cairo Geniza.
Okay.
Either one of these, and that's by Rabbi Mark Glickman. Both of them are really good texts, and they go in, they show pictures of what the Geniza, what it was, what they found, and they're like Rabbi Sachs said, 140,000 documents. I think they're still translating them.
Yeah.
They still don't have enough people to get through all of them, but it's a really fascinating story about the Geniza itself.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank good questions. Thank you, Scott. Harriet.
How did they date these documents in the 1890s, and how did they know there was an earlier version?
Oh, so the way in the past, at least, without some of the more modern tools we have, is they basically look for language. They talk. One of the easy ways is that they look for events, and mentioning events or lack of mentioning events that happen shortly after, or often ways scholars do it, and usually they're looking for basically language as well. So they could tell by looking at the Damascus document. They get an idea based on what they're talking about and all that, a basic historical time frame. And even Schechter and Ginsburg were right, and it was during this era of Jewish sects. It's just only later on, when the other scrolls are found, are they able to pinpoint it and say this is specific here to Qumran and a Qumran text. Scott.
And Harriet, you raise a great question about how they date them. I mean, they didn't have carbon dating, but they're, again, looking at the text with Rabbi Sachs, what he was saying, a lot of the Damascus document uses phraseology that is actually 180 degrees from certain phrases used in the book of Acts. So it's very interesting. They talk about vipers and the many. It's really interesting. When I gave my talk about 10 years ago at the Acts Academy, I gave some of those phrases, and they're very similar, but they're 180 degrees reversed. And therefore, this is what Robert Eisenman was concluding, that these documents, the Damascus document, probably had some kind of timing that was when the book of Acts was written. But they're 180 degrees reversed. It's very interesting. It's hard to explain just by saying it, but if we could show you some of the phrases, you would say, wow, that's pretty interesting. And from that, we could guess that that's when these documents could have been written.
Right. So basically, it's Scott explained it well. It's basically there's a fair amount of detective work, and if you think about it, if you could tell sometimes by looking at a text based on English, it's an older text, a newer text based on a phraseology. I'll give you one. And based on new words, my daughter used the other word hangry. Has anyone ever heard the word hangry?
Mhm.
Okay, what does hangry mean? Anyone know? I just learned.
You're hungry and therefore you're in a foul mood.
Yeah, okay, which is pretty much the way I live my life, actually. As I say, avoid me on fast days because it makes me very seriously grumpy. But so my daughter used it last week. I never heard of this word before. Apparently, Anne said, "Oh, it's in my it's in some of the books I read. It's slang." And my daughter Gabriella said, "No, it's not slang. It's a real word." So I Googled it, and apparently last month, I believe it was just added to the Oxford English Dictionary. So now it's a real word. So if you see the word hangry, you're probably not looking at a text that was written 300 years ago. It's of this millennium, shall we say. So obviously that's a very simplified version, but that's just one example of what scholars are really doing to try and identify texts. As Scott says, they're looking at other texts and trying to find similarities and differences and all these types of patterns as well. All right, good question. Thank you, Harriet.
Rabbi?
What's the book of Acts that Scott talks about?
You want to explain that, Scott?
The book of Acts is from the New Testament. It takes over after the death of Jesus, the followers, the followers, what happened after. And it's supposed to follow all the different apostles, but it basically follows what Paul did. So a lot of phraseology that he uses is used in the Damascus document, but not in the manner he uses them, in a different manner. Like I said, I could give you some of the examples, some of the Hebrew examples that are used in the Damascus document. Like I say, this idea of the many, the vipers, snake venom. I have to find the list because I wasn't ready. So it just, whenever those were written, whenever the book of Acts was written, it's using phraseology that's similar to what's in the book of Acts, but just opposite to the way they're used in the book of Acts.
Okay.
In fact, Robert Eisenman even calls the Damascus document the anti-Acts. It's really interesting.
Who calls it? Eiserman?
Eisenman calls it the anti-Acts.
Okay, interesting.
Rabbi or Scott?
Yes.
If you coming back to the question of that Harriet asked. Okay, so there was a time, as Scott said, there wasn't carbon dating. So you look at phrasing and other issues. Have they now tried to carbon date it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, the rabbi, I think he mentioned that they did, people have used carbon dating, but
Well, we did talk about some on the Dead Sea Scrolls. They've used carbon dating. I'm not sure as far as the other works of the Cairo Geniza. I would assume they have, but I think Scott wants to add a different point of view.
Yeah, I think Eisenman addresses this too, that it's very difficult. I mean, when you're looking, when you're trying to isolate to a century or something, it can be very accurate. But when you're trying to look between decades, I don't know how accurate. There's certain errors in that, and it's very difficult to pinpoint, where it is. I mean, you could tell it's probably from the 1st century as opposed to the 4th century by carbon dating, but I don't know how much more accurate you can be just relying on that. It really comes down to the text
Right.
of what's being
Right.
said. But yeah, definitely carbon dating has been used on these documents. But I don't know how reliable how much we can rely on it to pinpoint a date.
Right. So the importance here, particularly, this is the debate between Eiserman, who Scott mentioned, Professor Eiserman, and Professor Schiffman, who I'm basing the teachings on. Is you say a few decades here or there, give or take, who really cares? But what happens in a few decades is Christianity starts to develop. So Schiffman is taking the point of view, which is basically all of these texts are really before Christianity. They give us a window into what was going on as Christianity is born. But Eiserman will say, no, these could have more of a direct, perhaps even coded reference to developments that relate to Christianity. Is that a good way of putting it, Scott?
Yeah. And Rabbi, I have a good example. If I could share the screen, I could show if it would be available of how we would do this.
So if Ron could enable that. So while Ron is enabling that, I'll just say the book of Acts, I believe, is also a continuation of the Gospel of Luke as well. Someone asked about Acts, so it's interesting. Okay, so as soon as you're set up to go, Scott, you'll share that.
Yeah. Let's see. Do I hit share screen?
Yes.
Okay.
To be able to share.
Okay. Can you
There we go.
see? Can everybody see the Hebrew?
Mhm.
Yes.
Now, this isn't the Damascus document. This is the Habakkuk Pesher, and the rabbi is going to get to that next week. But here's an idea of how could we date this? And this also mentions the wicked priest. But what I want you to notice, it talks about the wicked priest and the teacher of righteousness, okay? And I'm giving you the Hebrew and Eisenman's English translation. Pesher al Kohen Arash Asher. This is the interpretation of the wicked priest who pursued after the Moriah Tzedek to swallow him with anger. Okay. Now, when can this be dated? Well, if we look at this, it says bekas hamato, in a real fierce anger, and then it uses a weird phrase. It says avit galuto. The aleph probably should have been a hey, but let's look at this. Avit galuto, to the house of his exile. In the end, at the completion of the Moed Menuchat, the festival of rest, or the holiday of rest. And here's an example. We have two males, a wicked priest and a righteous teacher. And most people will apply, well, which one is it? Is it the Moreh Tzedek, the righteous teacher, or the priest? Well, they're not sure about it. But if we look at it, the house of his exile, if that's what that means, well, if we look at the Talmud, we see the references in 4 places here that talk about a Bayit Galta, the house of exile, and it refers to the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin was actually exiled off the Temple Mount during the Roman period. So this probably is referring to the wicked priest. If he was part of the Sanhedrin, and they use a phrase, Beit Galuto, which could have been used in the Maccabean period, because the Sanhedrin, I would assume during the Maccabean period, if it existed, was still on the Temple Mount. So here we can date the Habakkuk Pesher. It has to be, if it's using that same type, it's nearly the same phrase. Here it's possessive. Here it's just subjective, the house of exile. Here it's his house of exile. So there, Harriet, is an example of how can we date the Habakkuk Pesher, and we could probably say it's being used at the same time the Talmud refers to it. So how's that? Does that make sense, or
It does.
I lost you?
It does make sense.
Okay, so thank you, Scott. No, that's a great example of how the phraseology really helps us identify a text era. Okay.
Did I hit back?
I have another question about the Geniza. So when we were looking at stuff in our old shul, there were a lot of important documents that we came across, but there was a lot of junk. There were things that people had written, or there were like numbers that people had written down and put God's name at the top for some reason, or Bamir to Hashem. And is this true of the Geniza? In other words, there were very important documents that they found. Did they also find a bunch of stuff that doesn't make any sense, or that is daily things that they were doing, and they put them in the Geniza because it had the name of God on it?
Many of the documents were commercial documents. They were contracts, bills of sale. Many of them had no reference to spiritual matters, but since they were in Hebrew, they may have had the name of God. They were actually set aside. They threw nothing out.
Thank you.
So thanks, Dad. So yeah, I went in my old shul, by the way, out of Zion in Northeast Philly. There was one guy who was adamant that any Hebrew text could not be thrown out. It had to be thrown in the Geniza. That's obviously not true. When I was in Israel last time, believe me, I read the Hebrew paper to practice my Hebrew. I threw it in the trash like everyone else did, and there's no halachic problem with that. But you could see people, especially if they're not really paying attention or they don't really understand the Hebrew for that matter. Oh, it has Hebrew writing on it. Throw it in just be safe. Throw it in the Geniza. I remember we had that experience. I remember sitting with Jonathan Jaffe and Gene. I think there were someone else there, but in the old building, we were going through some of the papers in our Geniza, we'll call it, as well. And there was a lot of stuff that didn't really need to be there, or a lot of stuff that wasn't necessarily a piece of Torah, but somewhere on it, someone was writing it, it had God's name on it. So probably these things are just probably common to shul life in general. Good
We have
question,
a
Harry.
famous collection in our shul too, where you can deposit Seamus, and I'd say at least 50% of it is not Seamus. It's just Hebrew. People don't know; they just throw it in the Seamus box.
Right. Which, yeah, you just see Hebrew on it, and you want to be on the safe side. So it makes sense. Thank you, Sam.
Rabbi, it's Eric. I have a question.
Yes.
I was reading about Constantine calling together when he was the Roman emperor, bringing all the various factions at that time of Christianity together to come up with some standardization of the religion at that time. So my question is, was there ever an attempt during this period to have a unified body to decide on ritual, similar to what Constantine did, I guess, 300 years later? Was there ever any kind of movement to standardize so there wouldn't be these kinds of sects?
So you're talking about Constantine's ecumenical Nicaea 325, the ecumenical council. So you do have at this point still, you have a Sanhedrin. They believe that, let's say, figures like Shammai were on the Sanhedrin. This is shortly before the destruction of the first temple, maybe a generation before. So you do have that. Even if we go back a little earlier, when Judah the Maccabee's brother Jonathan becomes the leader, he seems to be endorsed by some sort of like great assembly, great synagogue. I've heard it translated as basically some sort of not unanimous, but consensus type of position. So what we have during this period is we seem to have the different sects sometimes jockeying for power, jockeying for influence in the court. You have during the later Hasmonean period, you have people trying to gain the favor of Alexander Yanni or Jannaeus, and then after he dies, his wife Salmon. Where you have the Sadducees are in the ascendancy. Then you have the Pharisees, and under Herod, the Pharisees seem to have had some influence as well. So I don't think it's as, you don't have, I mean, you remember you're talking about Constantine. He's able to really, he's a general and he's able to unify. So he has a lot more authority, as opposed to the Jewish kings really don't have the authority that Constantine has. And they also have their political considerations to consider as well. So there seems to be some sort of attempts, but it's not nearly as comprehensive as Constantine's council, where you really have a council, and then you have a theology set. Particularly, the theology is Jesus as the same substance as the Father or not. And even though, interesting to note, even though they do come up with this theology that Jesus is equating Jesus to the Father, it really completes this process of Jesus going from prophet to divinity himself. You have what's called the Arian, and that's nothing to do with Germans, by the way, but the Arian heresy, which is very prominent, and I think even Constantine for a while switches sides to the Arian heresy side, which did not totally embrace this point of view. If Susan Warner was here, I'm sure she'd be able to give us more detail. But that's the general thought, is that he does have a theology, but it's not quite as sweeping as one might expect it to be. Okay. Good question, Eric. Anyone else? Okay, my friends. So again, thank you for joining me. I hope to see you next week. For those